I don't get you sometimes. Like, why are you the way that you are? Uh, oh, hey everyone, Nicole Steckline, technical agronomist for DeKalb and Asgrow in Northeast Iowa. And I'm here talking with my problem child of the year. That's right, soybeans. In fact, the field that I'm in right now actually had to be replanted. When it comes to trying to get a stand established, corn was much easier than soybeans this year, particularly because of the crust that we had. On top of that, if anybody's noticed, beans just grew really slow this year. But I want to ask you something. Has it just been this year, or the year before that, and the year before that, and the year before that, and the year before that? And does that coincide pretty closely to when we started getting really aggressive with our pre-emerge herbicides? My thought is probably yes. So the comment's been made to me quite a few times this year that, geez, it just seems like the beans aren't growing. Are we ever going to get to canopy? And honestly, the last 5, 6, 7 years has kind of been like that. And I think it coincides and matches up really well with where we're going with our pre-emerge herbicides. Now, we can't grow a bean crop without having weed management and weed control, but it is coming at somewhat of a cost. And that cost is that it is slowing these soybeans down in their early growth. Now, we need to keep in mind that whatever we spray on this ground and those weeds are sucking up and they are, they're not germinating because of it, or they're germinating and dying, these soybean plants are also sucking it up. And while it doesn't kill them, these herbicides are safe for our crop. They do have to suck it up and metabolize those herbicides. And we have been getting more and more aggressive with both our rates and the herbicides that we are using. So, been seeing a fair amount of issues with getting the beans out of the ground, and then not only that, but having some issues with some injury because of the weather that we had after planting or after spraying. And then not only that, but seeing some issues with herbicide carryover from our corn crop the year before. When it comes to herbicide injury in soybeans and any crop really, it really comes down to all of these different puzzle pieces, and do they come together at the right time to cause injury, and then will that injury cause stand loss and or yield loss? Probably the most common type of herbicide injury that we come across in soybeans is going to be our Group 15 drawstring on those leaves. Now, Group 15 herbicides are a residual only product. We're thinking about like the acetochlor that's in Warrant, the dimethenamide in Outlook, the metallochlor in Dual, or the pyroxasulfone that you see in the Zidua. Now, these are all a great class of chemistry that gives us good residual on primarily our small seeded broadleaves, which is water hemp, and our grass species. So we use these herbicides very heavily in our fight against water hemp in our soybeans. And it's really common that you're going to end up with those first leaves that are going to have that drawstring. So when it comes to, gosh, these beans are, they just aren't growing very fast. Well, you're getting that tie up of those leaves, so you aren't seeing that big full canopy early on. Not only that, but some of these herbicides can cause a little bit of stunting because, again, they've got to chew through, they've got to metabolize that herbicide just like the weeds do. Another very common herbicide that we get some injury is because of a PPO. Now, we use these PPO herbicides pretty heavily in our pre's, and that's because the PPOs are a contact burner. They are our burn down when we make our burn down application. Now, one of the things about this is that so we're thinking about like the sulfentrazone, those types of herbicides, that would be like the Authority and Authority First or Authority MTZ, a product like that. Those are giving us our burn down of our emerged weeds. However, those particular products can't be applied to these soybeans after they emerge. Otherwise, they burn the crop as well. Now, when you have the right timing of when that crop is coming out of the ground and it matches up with a rain, we can have the herbicide splashing back up onto that plant, or if we get it at the right time, and especially if that bean is just starting to emerge, you can have that PPO herbicide burning the crook of that bean and causing it to girdle at the soil surface and then eventually die. Another contributing factor that I've seen of herbicide response, injury, or death from the herbicide from our burn down application has been residue and seed to soil contact. So soil plays a really important role in buffering those herbicides from the seed. In a lot of cases, these herbicides, they don't really have a really high solubility rate, so they aren't going to move very far in the soil at all. So when we have really shallow planting depth, or if we are no-tilling into a really high residue scenario, if we're planting directly into that residue, or if we aren't getting the depth that we want on that planting, that herbicide can very easily move onto that seed or as it's starting to grow and cause a lot of injury that way. That's been a large contributing factor in a couple of these fields that I've been visiting as well. So timing of the rain paired with timing of the herbicide application paired with timing of emergence of that field is going to play a critical role in if you're going to see injury from that PPO herbicide or not. Another herbicide that we're starting to see used more is Metribuzin. So Metribuzin is a group 5 herbicide, and it's kind of a kissing cousin to atrazine. They're both in the same mode of action, where we know what atrazine does to soybeans is no bueno. Metribuzin can have the same effect, but soybeans are more tolerant to that molecule. However, there are some varieties that can be a little bit more sensitive to it given the right conditions. You also can have some soybean varieties that are more sensitive to those PPO inhibitors that we just talked about before. Now, again, a lot of this comes down to the weather and does it all line up? Do all the pieces of that puzzle come together at the right time to cause injury, plant death, or yield loss? Now, in a lot of years, we aren't going to see a whole lot of injury that is going to cause us yield loss, cause us to replant, but it does happen. And for some reason this year, I think a lot of it has been timing of the rains and timing of the crop emergence. I have seen probably a higher instance of some of these things happening. Now, that's not meaning that we need to tap the brakes and start pulling back on our pre's, because again, we cannot take our foot off the gas when it comes to managing water hemp in our soybean fields, but just be aware that these things can happen. They do happen, and really this is a big reason why it just feels like these beans are having a slow start. Now, something else that I'm seeing when it comes to herbicides and soybean response this year is carryover. And I've been seeing a little bit more carryover this year than I have in previous years. Now, carryover, again, it's about those puzzle pieces. Those puzzle pieces when it comes to carryover in soybeans are gonna really come down to a couple of things. The first one is gonna be what herbicide was sprayed. And that really has two parts to it. The first one is how sensitive are soybeans to that herbicide, and then also how persistent is that herbicide in the soil. The soybeans' level of sensitivities to a certain herbicide, that one's kind of a given, doesn't take a whole lot of explaining. But the level of persistence of each of these herbicides has a little bit more of a nuance to it. So a really good example of this is when you think about Flexstar or Famecifin carryover from your soybean crop the previous year into corn. First off, corn is very sensitive to that molecule, very sensitive to Famecifin. The other part of that is that it has a very long half-life, so it's very persistent in our soils. This is one of those reasons why, you know, it's always like, get your Flexstar, get your Famecifin on your beans before July 4th. That's kind of a rule of thumb, because when you look at the plant back interval of corn after an application of that herbicide, it needs that time to break down in the soil because it's very persistent. Not only that, but we need the water to make that breakdown happen. And if we don't get the water, that half-life becomes longer. Now, I know it feels like we had a really wet spring, and some of you have, but particularly when I look at my Jones, Jackson, Dubuque County area, parts of Delaware, we have missed a lot of rains. And we missed a lot of the rains last year too. So since some of these herbicide applications we haven't had a whole lot of water on those crops. So we haven't had the opportunity to break it down. It feels like we had a wet spring, but a lot of the reason why it feels like that is because we had a cold spring. So even if we didn't get a lot of moisture, it just kind of stuck there for a while because we didn't have the heat to make it go away. And then when the crop emerged and we did have the heat to make the moisture go away and the crop was growing, it was paired with very droughty conditions, which meant that these plants were stressed, and then they had another thing coming in and stressing them. They weren't able to grow well, they weren't able to metabolize well, which means they weren't able to metabolize that herbicide. Another really important piece of that carryover puzzle is soil type. So the soil is a buffer between the seed and that herbicide. And when we think about, let's say, nitrogen, where we think about we apply it and that corn crop soaks it up and it leaches out and then it's gone for the season. When we think about herbicides, really they aren't that water soluble. They don't move that far in the soil. In fact, we don't really want them to. When we're putting out that layer of residual, we want it to stay really in that top 2 inches of soil where the weeds are germinating, particularly when we're thinking about grasses and water hemp. So we know that that herbicide is really going to stay in that root zone, especially if we aren't tilling that soil. So particularly when you think about a no-till or minimum till situation, if we aren't tilling, then we aren't mixing that herbicide in with another 6 inches of soil, so we aren't diluting that. So really what we're waiting for is for that herbicide to break down or adhere to the soil. So there's something called adsorption, and that's something that happens when you have organic matter and that herbicide particle sticks to that soil organic matter. And what that's doing is it's sticking to that organic matter so that the plant can't suck it up, but it's still breaking down. So when we see a low organic matter soil, a sandy soil, that's going to be a situation where we have more potential for that plant to soak up that herbicide if it's persisting in the soil. We just covered a lot of ground in there. Really, when it comes down to it, stay aggressive with your herbicide programs. Know that there is some injury possible, but that's kind of one of the prices that we pay when we're trying to control a very tough to control weed like water hemp. And not only that, but they're starting to grow out of it. We will reach canopy. This is just going to become an every year thing where we're going to get a slow start, but we're going to get there. But now I'm going to go look at some rootworm. Until next time, if you got any questions, call, text, or email.